are several different ways of doing that, and you know, I've tried lots of different things with my quilts, and in fact, I probably should have brought some of the quilts again tonight that we looked at last week at my house. If you remember the one that was what I said was supposed to have been Easter dresses for the girls, and instead we made a quilt. Okay, on that one, I just, my backing on the back side, I just made it big enough so that I actually just rolled it over to the top. That's not really a very kosher way of binding a quilt, but that's what I did, and that was one of my first quilts, and it worked. But they usually like to have something that's thicker and heavier, because what's going to be the first thing to wear out is going to be your edges, your binding. I actually brought a little sample tonight where I did 3 different types of binding on it, so you can look at these. This one right here, you cut a strip, your strip of fabric, and you just fold it in half. Fold it in half. You apply that, see, you stitch it around the piece like that, and then what happens is that just totally gets folded over to the back, and then you hand stitch it down. Okay, that is probably what's considered the way to finish off to bind a quilt. If you put a quilt in a quilt show and you're going to have it judged, all those kind of things, they're going to look to make sure it's done that way. So that is the standard right there. To me, that takes forever. The quilt, the one that came from my guest room, which I had quilted, and it was in pinks and greens, pale pinks and greens. That quilt, I did do that way because I wanted everything on that quilt to just be perfect. But it takes a long time to stitch all the way around it was a queen-size quilt. It's a long ways around there. That took me longer than putting together the quilt top. Okay?
Are the strips just straight grain, not bias?
Okay, on our bindings, let's talk about those. As long as your quilt is just straight edges, you can use straight grain. If you're going to have a quilt that has like bordered or scalloped edges, then you must use a bias for your binding, okay? So if it's straight edges, you can use straight grain, but anything with any curves on the edges, you have to use the bias binding. Now, binding. You've got to make a strip of binding long enough to go all the way around all 4 sides of your piece, plus an additional 6 or 8 inches to play with. Okay? Now that's pretty long when you start adding all of that up. And you sure can't buy a piece of fabric that's that long to get one strip. So how do you put those together? So I brought some things for us to look at that. Okay, so you've got, I think I have 2 pieces. So here's my 2 strips, and you can pretend they're long strips, the full width of the fabric. You put these together like this, okay? So now we've got a little square where they're overlapped. And you know how much we like to stitch diagonal lines, right? So there's our square. We're stitching a diagonal line, okay? Stitch the diagonal. You're going to clip that off a 1/4 inch outside the line. And the reason you do it that way is then when it becomes a long strip, all of the bulk of the seam is not going to be in one place because we've now made it an angled piece. And this is one place where you do press open because you don't want all the bulk of the seam in one spot. And so with it being crossways like that, it's not all in one place when you fold it over. Okay? So that's how you get your binding strips, and you stitch them together the same way, whether they're bias strips or straight grain strips. All right. Now let's look at this is a way that I like to put a binding on because it's a separate binding, but I get to do it all with the machine, which we all know I love to sew with the machine. So you get your long strip and you're going to sew, you're going to lay it right size together on the back, not on the front. See, the other one we stitched on the front, wherever that one is. But this one we're going to lay on the back. Before I do that, I press a 1/4 inch over on the strip. So now I can bring it around to the front, lay it down, and I've got a finished edge there, and then I top stitch around that. Okay? That's the way that I like the most. Just remember, if you're going to put it in a quilt show, you got to do it the other way. If you're going to be judged, you got to do it the other way. But what I want to show you here is how you get a nice how to make this corner. Because again, you want it to be a nice little mitered corner. So here we are. Let's put this up here. We're stitching along here, and we're coming up here to this edge. You want to stop a 1/4 inch from the edge again, okay? Now, take your piece and lay it so it's a straight line out from this edge that we're going around the corner to. So this makes a straight line out here. Now, bring this back like this, and now starting right there at the end, come and do your 1/4 inch seam this way. When you turn that out, you can see on here, you can actually see the little mitering in the corner. Okay? And then when you bring it around here, you have to fold that little mitered spot in. And this is the one place where I pin. I pin like crazy. And I don't when I'm piecing my quilt top together, but I really pin this down all the way around. I'm just flipping out pins as I go.
So when you sew on top, is it just kind of going in the ditch on the back? Or kind of.
Yeah, it does.
This goes right in.
It
goes
really
right,
is right along that edge. Now, a couple of years ago, Kathy and I went to a quilt show at Shipshewana. And I found this little tool, and it's called the binding thingy. That's its title, binding thingy. And boy, they get to charge pretty good price for that binding thingy.
Yeah.
But,
Makes it life easier to buy them.
but here's the binding thingy. And on this one, what you do, this is the third one I've got right here. Right here. On this one, you cut your strips, and you just sew your strip along one side. And you leave some hanging off, just like we did on our mitered corners. And you take this, and you cut it there, that shape. And you're going to bring one across this way, and you're going to cut it that shape. And then you lay those two together, and you sew that, this. And then when you fold it together, here's what you've got.
Oh, yeah.
Try and use it like this.
So with this one, you don't have to have the huge, long piece of binding that goes around the whole quilt. Your pieces just have to be
A little bit longer.
than each edges. Okay, so that's the binding thingy. If you want to look it up online and get one, or run to Shipshewana and get one. Okay.